All right, well, thank you, everybody. I am here, as I was just introduced, to talk a little bit about big data and customer analytics. That is sort of the focus of Clarabridge, and sort of its focus has been really my business and my life for the last 10 years or so. But I'd like to start first by just talking about our origins, because I do think Clarabridge, and I think symptomatic or representative of a lot of companies here, is very much a Northern Virginia company. Then I'll talk a little bit about where customer data, I think, is driving a lot of big data investments in both analytics, technology, distribution of information, et cetera. And then I'll close on a few comments about where I think the big data space is going, specific to customer information and customer analytics, because it is an interesting space. We don't talk about it as much here in the DC area, but it is something that's starting to really become a big theme in a lot of big companies around the country and around the world. So our origins, I would say the first origin of Clarabridge was MicroStrategy, as was just said. But the other big origin was after spending about 9 years there were several of us from MicroStrategy that left in the summer of 2001, actually August timeframe, and started a company called Clariview. And Clariview was started because we recognized, after first trying to take a few months off of vacation, that what we'd learned at MicroStrategy, which was how to bring lots of data sources together to provide shared understanding of a larger context of what's going on in the world, could be applicable after 9/11. And Clariview was really first focused on trying to apply what we'd learned in the commercial domain to the government domain. We quickly evolved the company to a hybrid mix of government and commercial business, and ended up doing some interesting work with a company called an organization called the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, which was also created by government. This was the accounting regulatory agency that was formed after the blow-up of Enron and other companies that I know a little bit about that had some accounting and restatement issues. And that company actually encouraged us to start looking at not just mining data, but mining text, specifically looking at audit reports and filings that went to the SEC to try to see if we could correlate interesting disclosures with interesting issues of accounting oversight. And after prototyping that and doing a couple of other prototypes, we ended up deciding to form Clarabridge with the same founders. Actually, one of the founders of both Clariview and Clarabridge is Justin Langseth, who subsequently founded Zoom Data, which I notice is a sponsor here today. So the thread continues. And then the other last thing I'll mention about starting a company, particularly in the product space, is Clarabridge did raise a fair amount of money, and the early money that we got into the company came from two VCs that do a lot of work here in the Mid-Atlantic region. Boulder Ventures, which despite its name actually does a lot of work here in Virginia and Maryland, and then Growtech, which is based just up the street in Tysons Corner as well. So what started our interest in big data in the customer space? I think big data, and particular big data applied to customer analytics, is very much part of the arc of history and the arc of technology. Forrester actually made this graph a few years ago to describe how technology innovation has been invested over the last 50 to 100 years. In the early 20th century, manufacturing investments allowed us to make things at scale. The age of distribution, which followed, allowed us to actually deliver and distribute those things at scale. First, you have mass automation, then you have mass distribution, rails, national highway networks, air networks, delivery networks. Starting in the 90s and really going to the end of the last century, a lot of investment was made in IT, but the IT investment was really designed to optimize transactions, the actual consummation of retail or shipping or ordering or financial transactions. And that allowed a lot of data that was previously in paper to be digitized. And then really the last wave, which is the wave we're living in right now, is the wave of the age of the customer, which is where now all of this data becomes applicable and useful to derivative uses, like understanding what people want, what they need, like predicting, like understanding threats and alerts that might be aggregated from many different sources of information that had previously been siloed. And when you do that, and then you merge the last part of the age of the customer, which is customers now have created their own IT infrastructure. It's called the internet. We now have this whole other source of information to tap into, which isn't even owned by the corporate world anymore. And it becomes its own entity that becomes really interesting when you merge it and fuse it with information that companies have. So we live in the age of the customer, and the age of the customer is the age of big data. Now, the challenge and the opportunity when you start a company in this space is that everybody gets that intellectually. Most people don't do it well in implementation. And we've actually been tracking this through analysts that follow the customer experience, which is CX, or voice of the customer space, that when you poll executives in big companies and say, are you customer-centric? They'll all say, yeah, we collect data. We try to figure out what customers want based on market research or surveys, or maybe we got some guy that reads social media. But we aren't really doing a good job of using that information in an operationally reactive and proactive way to optimize the experience for our customers. And the companies that are doing that are generally more responsive to customer needs, more nimble when it comes to customer threats, and generally more profitable when it comes to customer loyalty. So the opportunity is to help companies use big data, use all of this information that's inside and outside their networks to make a better sense of what drives customer loyalty and satisfaction. And if you think about the customer, that's all of you. You interact with brands now in many different ways. You are informed like customers never were before, because if you have a question, it's literally at the tip of your fingers. And you also have a voice. If you don't like something, you're not just complaining to the neighbor next door. You're complaining to potentially thousands or millions of people, depending on the access you have to media and social media. So the challenge is, if you're a company, how do you make sense of all of that information across all of the different sort of journey points or touch points of the customer experience? When you're becoming aware you're consuming media, when you're researching, you're on social media or review sites. When you buy something, you're interacting with a company and that's generating data. When you're actually getting support or use or returning or filing a claim, or basically at any point in the customer journey, you're generating more information. And then finally, if you buy more or you churn, there's more information that predicts why you do that and how you do that. So companies have all that data, but it's not linear, right? Customers pick where they want to go. They don't necessarily follow your signs. And they also are posting and talking and generating records in literally dozens of different places. So the big data challenge is, first, how do I collect all that information, right? And the data, again, is inside the company, outside the company, shared by third-party syndicators, in social media, given up by the customer. It's everywhere, right? And so there's a lot of connecting and collecting that has to be done. Three big challenges when companies try to figure out how to do customer analysis at scale is, first, unsolicited feedback. Most companies have to quickly recognize that they can't just deal with the data inside their business. So they've got to go find a way to bring all that data that's outside the business in. The second is they quickly see many different silos for marketing, for sales, for support, for transaction processing, for finance. And so they've got to basically bring everything together in one place so that they can correlate and understand what drives what. And then the last thing is the technologies have been rapidly changing. So if companies have tried 5-6 years ago to do something in Hadoop or maybe SQL before, and then they're moving to Elasticsearch or streaming technologies, they can't keep up with the technology. And there's a huge opportunity if you're a company or a software provider or a consulting provider to help businesses navigate this. They cannot do it all themselves. The technology and the pace of change is just too great right now. It will stabilize in a few years, but right now we're at kind of maximum chaos. So there's a huge opportunity for everybody. So how do we do this? Well, historically, companies would have different sources that would probably be bought by different departments and used by different users inside the organization. Where we are today is most companies walk down the hall and borrow some information from a third party or from a different source, and pretty soon you end up with chaos, which is that picture. I like to call this our spaghetti situation, which is nobody really owns everything, everybody's sharing it, and nobody really understands what they're looking at. So the challenge and the opportunity is build that big platform that brings everything together and then distributes it to all the right people. For us, what that means is 3 kinds of data: surveys, interaction feedback, which is any conversation between a customer and a representative of the company, and online feedback, which is anything, anywhere online. And a lot of that data is unstructured. So for us, that also means, how do I take unstructured data and make it quantitative, make it measurable, make it useful? This is sort of the big evolution that occurred, at least in our sort of thinking when we moved from MicroStrategy to the Claras, which was, we're not just looking at rows and columns anymore. We're looking at fundamentally free-form content. But free-form content can be extremely useful if you can turn it into quantitative content and then run it through all the traditional analytics techniques and processing techniques of data warehousing or big data. And then finally, how do you use it? Companies are using this information in 2 primary ways. The first is what I would describe as business optimization. That's understanding threats, trends, issues, emerging problems that aren't yet problems, and acting proactively to contain the problem, to understand the requirement, or to ultimately reduce the cost that might come from not solving a problem sooner. And then the second use case is frontline response. And this is the traditional social media use case, which is some guy, gets his guitar broken on United Airlines and tweets about it, and you want to reach out to him before he's got 1 million followers and everybody hates United Airlines. It's the frontline response. It's getting back to people when they have a tactical question more quickly and sifting through all of the noise to find those people that you need to reach out to. When you do that right, you basically have what is effectively a big data solution that connects to everything and uses everything to drive better actions and better insights. I won't spend a ton of time on this just in the interest of not wanting to give you a natural language processing lesson, but I think it's cool because I think it gives you a sense of how you make unstructured data structured. First, you have to run information through what we call natural language processing, right? And the first thing is take a piece of information like this review. Somebody's complaining about their experience trying to get money out of an ATM, right? So it's basically, it's free form, it's got some misspellings, it's got an emoticon, there's a little bit of information that you understand quickly and other stuff that you might not, like a hashtag. So first you have to parse that information. And what natural language processing is about is understanding all the different words, their parts of speech, their connections to each other, whether they're being negated or modified using different types of prepositions or conjunctions or other types of things. We also need to normalize the information into concepts. So if I say something is a Big Mac, that doesn't mean it's a large Mac, it's actually a hamburger, right? So knowing how to map those kinds of things. And then finally, you take that information and you come up with basically what we would describe as entity pairs. Now I have a distinct piece of structured data. I can do all kinds of really interesting analysis with that, right? But before I've done that, I'm really just reading, and I'm bottlenecked by the human process of reading every single review on every single web page or every single survey that someone's telling me about me. When I'm down to entities and structured data, I can start analyzing it. The second thing I need to do is sentiment. So sentiment is a huge part of understanding and predicting customer behavior, because if someone says something with positive sentiment, they're generally more likely to do good things. If they say things with negative sentiment, they're generally likely to do bad things. So we look at words as inherently either neutral, positive, or negative, and then we modify them based on how other words describe those words. So if I say the tellers are kind, kind is a nice word, that's +2 on a scale of negative to +5. Too long might be negative, but if I say way too long, the word way is modifying the too long and making it even more negative, right? And if I say very kind, that makes it even more kind. So very quickly, if I look across thousands and millions of interactions, I can get a good sense of how people are sharing their opinions and what likely the positive things correlate to good behaviors and the negative things correlate to negative behaviors when I start running analysis on it. And it can get really fun too. If I say super sick is actually a positive sentiment, even though sick itself, if you're below 40, you might not understand that. But because I'm modifying a thing, not a person or a place, and I'm not using it as an adverb, if I say I am sick, that's actually negative. And our natural language processing algorithms can figure this stuff out. Ultimately, people will use hashtags and emoticons, and you need to be able to understand everything. So by training and learning and tuning these kinds of algorithms over time, you get a very good understanding of how to turn language into analytics. Eventually, you want to be able to come up with a whole set of sentiment that isn't just about, hey, this document's neutral or negative, but all the different things that people are saying and what's positive and neutral and negative, so I can get very, very fine grain, and then I can do very, very detailed analysis. And if you don't know what you're looking for, you also need to be able to create high-level models that we can sort of tune based on what we know people care about in banking or retail or insurance or technology or consumer goods. But if you don't know, you can also use something called theme detection. And a big part of when you get to big data is using essentially a learning algorithm that looks for things that cluster with each other and then suggests ways of creating groupings or categories. And so when you get into this realm, you're having to run a lot of data into a lot of different learning algorithms to figure out what should I be looking for if I don't know what I'm looking for. It's looking for what Dick Rumsfeld once called the unknown unknowns, right? The things I don't know that I don't know. Machine learning is really good for figuring out what those unknown unknowns are, because it'll look for patterns and trends that are anomalous and therefore might be interesting at looking at for more insight. And so theme detection is a big part of doing that. So when you pull all this together, and then you also train your systems on the internet at large. And the internet itself is an incredible source of information too, because we find that when a product comes up that hasn't been described before, or a particular term of use starts showing up in social media, it probably means it's something we should be looking for in our customers' data as well. And that's about, again, using the internet as a training set, which is a big data problem, because you have to first figure out where did you want to go to get that information, and then you want to figure out how do I apply it to the information that my customers might care about. That becomes another way of tracking new companies, new competitors, new problems, new threats that might exist in your business. And it becomes an interesting challenge because keeping that data fresh becomes a big scaling problem. So you need to have the technology and the kind of connectors to pull all that data together. When you're done, if you do it right, you end up with a system that really can take all of that information on the top and turn it into analytics in the bottom. And then the analytics can be consumed by people and even by machines, because then machines can say, here's a problem I think I need to direct a person towards. And that ultimately is sort of where you take what is this big, hairy problem and you turn it into something that you can at least understand and consume. And then the last piece is reporting, and I'll just mention this briefly. When we started our company a few years ago, we thought we'll build the engines. The engines are really the most important part of the problem we're trying to solve. But we hit a wall because people said, how do I consume this information? So I think, and it, again, not surprising, seeing some of the vendors in the room next door, a big part of making sense of big data is actually having the right visualization techniques. Because first of all, big data is constantly changing, so it needs to be constantly monitoring and learning. The second is big data needs to be represented for this human form factor, which is eyeballs and brains. And there's a big disconnect right now that visualization and reporting helps to make work. So you can't talk about big data without talking about reporting and visualization. The two go hand in hand. So finally, who cares about this stuff? A lot of people do care about this stuff. I mean, every one of these logos here is a company that has worked to tame big data from social and survey and email and live chat and phone call and transcript. And they're doing things like United Airlines figures out when they merged with Continental a few years ago, what do people love and hate about the United policies being applied to Continental and the Continental policies being applied to United. Verizon uses it to understand when there's a big hurricane, what neighborhoods are talking about being out of service so that they can proactively send text messages to people's phones saying, don't worry, we're not going to charge you this month. Or it can be people like Amazon trying to identify the most commonly complained issues when people call a call center when a new Kindle comes out so that they can quickly fix that problem and reduce the angry customers. And by doing that, they maintain the highest customer satisfaction of any tablet device in the market today because they are real time and they're constantly listening and monitoring. And there's literally dozens of stories like this. There's ROI when you do this because you actually do keep your customers happy and you do keep your customers loyal. So that's sort of what we do. And we've done this now for about 10 years. We, like McDonald's like to say, we've processed billions and billions of records, up to about 15 billion at this point. The business is based here in Northern Virginia. We're out in Reston, always been a Fairfax County based company. A lot of the work has come over the years of first sort of trying to figure out interesting technical problems to solve and then applying them until we find a resonant market. And I think that we've seen this customer experience market being a really interesting and resonant market because it's really at the conversion of three big trends. The first is people are moving away from, and have been for now the last decade or so, from on-prem solutions to cloud solutions because they cannot build these systems at scale and at cost on their own. The second is the rapid evolution of social media as the primary means for doing market research now, at least passive market research, if you don't have a way of collecting and making sense of that data. And the third is, I think, the conversion of the marketing and the IT buyer in many organizations. IT buyers have historically made buying decisions based on technology meeting features and requirements for internal support and efficiency. Marketing and sales buyers are now driving the development and actually the acquisition of technology, particularly in the cloud, based on their ability to drive customer satisfaction and loyalty. And so as the buying model has changed, there's been a lot more interested in these kinds of technologies, even if internally companies might not be comfortable building them themselves. And so the other big thing about big data, particularly in the commercial space, is it's all cloud. There's very little big data, at least on the application side, that's done on-prem. Companies are building systems internally, but when they start thinking about these kinds of applications, they're almost all done in the cloud. So, our technology, because the market has evolved quite a bit, and I think this is the story of many companies over the last decade. 10 years ago, if you wanted to store data, you used SQL. Now, everything is NoSQL because it can be scaled linearly across cheap equipment in a way that SQL still can't be right now, regardless. Is anyone here from Oracle? I'm sorry. I think that's just my personal opinion. Love Oracle, use it for 15 years before I discovered, NoSQL religion. On-premises to cloud. Again, because particularly if the data you're collecting is cloud, it's easy to develop solutions in cloud. And this space in particular, when you think about CRM platforms like Salesforce and social media and survey platforms and even financial platforms, more and more people are comfortable buying those transactional platforms and using those social media platforms in the cloud. So if you're in the big data space, it's logical that you would want to build your solution in the cloud as well. And that seems to be an interesting trend going forward. And the other big thing is analytics with the advent of big data isn't just a project-based initiative anymore, right? 10 years ago, when people thought about answering a question like, do my customers like green or red M&Ms? They would go run a survey, collect 1,000 responses, and answer the question. Today, surveys are always on. I mean, you probably have all seen this. You go to Starbucks, or you fly on United Airlines, or you stay at a hotel. More often than not, you're going to get a survey. And those surveys are always running. And they're always instrumenting and monitoring and tabulating your feedback based on who you are, where you stayed, what kind of room you had, what your customer tier of service is. So those always-on systems are constantly trying to figure out, how do I make you happier? How do I keep you from churning? And then the final thing and where we're going is that this technology is moving away from purely analytical uses. When you have enough data and you can do enough analytics and you get confident enough about what the analytics are telling you, you can move directly into the realm of telling your application or your computer to close out a transaction, right? To make an order, to send that coupon to the customer, to do something that actually gives them sort of the response they need. And in a way, you're cutting out or disintermediating people, employees in your company, because the technologies are getting that good. And that's really where I think you're going to see a lot of this application of technology evolving over the next few years. And so that's what I'll kind of close on, which is sort of where are we headed? And I would say, first of all, don't just believe me. Believe the analysts and thought leaders, folks like Gartner, Forbes, Forrester, Bruce Temkin, who tracks the space, have basically been tracking that, the traditional way of discerning customer insights from a survey, that's a dead model, right? More and more people are, and that's the lowest bar on that graph there. Those are the people that think multiple choice surveys are a good way of understanding your customer, right? The way people want to understand customers is lots of other things. And technology is a key part of how people are thinking about customer insight now. They're thinking about text mining, they're thinking about predictive analytics, they're thinking about pulling data from different types of sources like voice. So nowadays, when you make a call to a call center and you're told your call may be recorded for quality purposes, that was the original use case for the last 20 years. Somebody would record the phone calls, keep them for about a week, and if you said a bad word or you screamed, there would be a little alert that would pop up on the call center manager's desk. I'm not looking at you, Chinny. Sorry. Sorry. You're laughing. You like me. We're very dynamic people. We like to get our voices up. But no, it's not just that now. Now what's happening is these calls are being recorded and transcribed into text and then being mined, just like any other data. Not everyone's doing it, but I would say some of the biggest healthcare companies, banks, retailers are absolutely doing it. I can tell you that for a fact. And even Forbes magazine, not the most tech-savvy magazine, has actually said this is happening. This is happening. This is a big prediction for this year, that unstructured data is going to start to be a primary source for insights in companies going forward. I think the other key part to where we're going is the merging, and again, some of this is just the evaluation of the market that we're in. When you start to think about analytics, not just about quantities and numbers and widgets and rows and columns, but words and sentiments and intentions and emotions, you get to a point where you're not just letting the computer figure out the what, you're letting it figure out the why and how something makes a person feel. And sentiment is key to the next wave of big data over the next 10 years. And the work that companies like we are doing is, I think, the precursor to what I like to think of as emotionally empathic computing, right? Which is computers that don't just say, you ask for this, here's what you get, but you feel like this, here's what I should do to make you feel better. And this is our lifetime. It's kind of freaky and a little bit creepy, but I mean, we're in a world where the data and the technology is getting close to the mark of, at least in defined environments, being able to be empathic about how to keep you getting what you want and feeling like you're being served by the companies you do business with. And the other key part of it is, as you continue to build these systems, they need to be guided by several core principles. They need to be open to always bringing in new information. So the big data problem never stops. Today, people post text and pictures. Tomorrow, people are going to be, posting videos that are going to be automatically interpreted on Facebook, right? And so video is going to become a big part of it. The spectrum, which is where you are and how you do business with companies, is constantly evolving. So new sources of information are going to have to be fed into these systems to analyze and instrument customer feedback. They also need to go from the traditional to the highly advanced in the forms of analytics. And there's a sort of a continuum that people like to talk about with analytics, from sort of counting things to looking at the rate of change, which is basic calculus, to looking at what's statistically significant, which is basic statistics, to basically predictive, which is saying based on the statistics of what normally happens, what will happen or what was likely to happen, to prescriptive, which is now that I know what is likely to happen, what should I do if that's a good outcome to ensure that outcome, or what should I not do to ensure that that doesn't happen if it's a bad outcome. And so the technology is starting to, and there are companies and there are technology platforms that can do all 5 of those things equally well. And the key is figuring out use cases and identifying who's going to buy that and how it's going to help them. And right now, we're in this phase of exploring all the different ways you can use all 5 of those analytic techniques based on the domain and the problem you're trying to solve. And then, of course, none of this is possible without huge investments in scale. And I think any company that is going to market today needs to think, will my product support the needs of my customers for at least the next 2 years? And if not, I need to be doing R&D to basically advance the next 2 years out. And that's about the life cycle that I think we've seen make sense. If you look more than 2 years out, you're making bets. And if you're less than 2 years out, you're taking chances, because your technology may not meet the needs of your customers when they most want it. And then finally, making sure that you're always looking at ways to automate and transact and move away. Don't build solutions just for analysts in a back office. Build solutions for front office people, for consumers, because ultimately that's what drives acquisition of technology and value to customers. I'll skip that. So the last thing I'll say, AI, I don't want to take credit for this, but this I think is a really interesting construct that a guy named Pedro Domingos talked about. He wrote a book called The Master Algorithm about 1.5 years ago. He's a researcher from University of Washington. And he described how AI and machine learning is evolving sort of like astronomy did in the 15 and 1600s. So stick with me here. You'll enjoy it in the end, even though it's kind of geeky. So the guy on the left is Tycho Brahe, Kepler's in the middle, and Isaac Newton's in the right. And when we think about what happened, first of all, Brahe was known for, over many years, every night going up into his observatory, that's what that picture is, and collecting data on where all the planets were relative to each other. And he did this for about 10 years. And that is essentially big data. That's a big data problem. It's collecting the data. What Brahe, or Kepler, did is he then plotted the data. He did curve fitting, if you will, regression analysis, if you will. And he was able to identify, based on the data, what the likely orbits were of all the planets around the sun, and also some of the stars and where they were relative to where we were, because he was essentially taking that data and learning off the data and coming up with patterns. And then Newton, we all know what Newton did. Newton derived laws, right? The laws of gravity, laws of motion, which ultimately allowed us to predict and then to act on those predictions with the creation of transformative technologies and inventions, right, that then take us to the next level. And so we're in the business right now of first collecting the data, secondly, fitting the data, that's the analytics, and then using the data to transform our society. This is essentially what we are all doing if we're in big data. And it is as significant as what these guys did in the 15 and 1600s, I believe. We can train our systems to understand people, places, things, sentiment, what's private, what's not. When you say a bad word versus not, so you can hide it. we can help categorize and cluster and figure out things that customers don't even know what to look like when we start applying this technology to enough data. And the tipping point is when our systems move away from manual everything, right, which is a human being has to interact with the machine to make sense of the data, to the machine figures this stuff out on its own, right? And that's, again, where a lot of machine learning is going. It'll happen in text, it'll happen in data, it'll happen in signal processing, it'll happen in intelligence gathering, it'll happen everywhere. And when we start doing this with repeatable scale and precision, that's when people will start getting comfortable, hopefully, with machine learning, as long as they don't take over the world. I'm a little worried about that. And it also will allow us to basically take much more proactive decisions in business, in government, in policymaking, because we'll essentially have the confidence of machines saying, of 100 different scenarios, here are the ones that are the most likely scenarios that we think are what's really going on here. Now, ultimately, we aren't going to be, if we're a big data analytics company, which is we are today, we're not really going to just be analytics companies. We're going to be ultimately defined by the value of the data we collect. And I think what we realize, certainly at Clarabridge, and I think a lot of companies in the big data space are realizing, is that it's important to keep the data, because the data is not just useful for the initial purpose that we collected it for. It's ultimately useful in many, many derivative ways. When you start, it's just like, teaching a kid. A kid is going to see something 100 different ways. You don't want them to just take in one insight from one interaction. You want them to continue to relearn over and over again. And that's essentially what big data companies are doing when they keep the data. And so I think over time, the technologies have to be able to maintain and retain information. Ultimately, we get into this field, and this is, again, not my slide. This is from a book from about 25 years ago. This concept of intelligence really follows 3 stages. Right now, we're at the early to mid stage, which is narrow intelligence for very specific purposes, general intelligence for certain kinds of things like driving a car, or automatic bots that can do 1 or 2 things very interesting that aren't quite fully human. But we're in that narrow general space right now, and I think that over the next 10, 15 years, it's entirely possible we're going to hit at least early superintelligence, and we're going to start dealing with computers a lot more than we are with people for certain kinds of interactions. Hopefully they're good people and good computers, so we'll see. And then the final thing I'll say, final thing, is that everything I just said could be completely BS, right? Because what we found is that we often get overly optimistic about this stuff when it's happening at a rate of change. And right now, big data is happening at a really, I think, explosive rate of change. If I look here on, this is the Gartner Hype Cycle from 2016. Cognitive expert advisors, machine learning, are at the top of the peak of inflated expectations. And what that means in Gartner speak is when you're at the top of that curve, you're going to go through a long and depressing period of people not hitting the expectations they want from this technology, right? Because everyone's putting tons of money and effort into thinking about how they're going to change the world with this stuff. And we get into what they call the Trough of Disillusionment. Now, the good news about getting in the Trough of Disillusionment is once you hit that, you're at rock bottom, you have nowhere to go but up, right? So I think we're in for a really interesting few years, depending on where we really are. I think we may be at the peak, or we may be slightly going down a bit, but we will eventually find ways to make a lot of really interesting things happen with this stuff. And hopefully, some of us get a chance to make some good money along the way as well. So anyway, I think that's about it. I'll take a break, and I think we have time for a few questions if there are any questions. Thank you.